Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great week so far. I'm Sheree Burton. This is Women Seeking Wholeness, and this is episode 152. Can grief and gratitude coexist? Well, according to my guest, Bethany Harvey, they totally can. She's actually a debut memoirist whose book, Dipped in It, reached the bestseller list on both Barnes & Noble and Amazon when it was released in July of 2021. But what's interesting, and she'll share a little bit about her story, but she was in a really deep grief episode. It was really hard for her to climb out. She'd typically not had a very strenuous or stressful life to that point in terms of trauma or anything significant. Things were pretty smooth, and you'll hear her story. But what I found really interesting is that we just can't skip over the grief process in order to heal. Like, there's no other way to heal other than to just dive in. And so her way of doing that in a very gentle way, and the answer is yes, gratitude and grief can coexist. She says we can weep, rage, belly laugh, ache over the beauty and fragility of life all in one day, hour, or moment. It all gets to belong. So you can follow her on Bethany Harvey Author, and also go on over to my Instagram, Sheree.Burton, where we explore some of the things she talked about and dive a little deeper. Bethany, welcome to Women Seeking Wholeness.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we have a really dear mutual friend, Monica Rogers, and I love who I get to connect with through other amazing women. And you're one of them. You came through an amazing woman that we both know. I know you guys have been friends for a long time, but when I got your book, and thank you for sending it to me, by the way, I instantly was like, okay, that's a really compelling title. But as I started to thumb through it and look at all the topics that you explored, I'm like, you are deep and you've been walking in it. I know that Dipped in It has multiple layers of meaning, right?
Yeah.
Why don't we start there? I need to probably give people some contextual information. So today, your book has a lot. It's themed around the loss of your father a lot, and some of the circumstances of your life 5 years ago. But today happens to be the anniversary of his passing. And you were telling me earlier that you hadn't put that together when you set up our interview. And I was like getting chills because I said, well, there's not an accident in that. I trust it. I trust when people come on and the circumstances that align for us to have these conversations. So it's a tender day for you. But you also said that there's been a lot of healing and that you've come to a place of gratitude and joy with other areas of your life that have kind of completed that or helped to inform you coming into a different level of healing with it.
Yeah. Well, it was just today, the only time that I had found myself actually crying. I was laughing because they were actually tears of joy about something, a message that somebody sent me that had absolutely nothing to do with my father. But I thought, well, that's funny. The first tears of the day are tears of really appreciation and gratitude. I found myself kind of getting more worked up about it last night for whatever reason, just the anticipation of it and just the real gravity of realizing that it has been 5 years and how much has happened in those 5 years that he never got to experience and wasn't a part of. I feel like that's a whole nother layer of grief is what you lost and then thinking about what they've missed.
Sure. I'm glad that we're going to be talking about grief today because, and by the way, this episode will air right around his birthday too. So you said his birthday is January 28th. I think what we're experiencing right now, I told you this earlier, is a lot of people walking around with undiagnosed grief. They're literally grief stricken. And they're not even aware that they are. Let's start there. What are your thoughts about that? What do you think that's about? Even I have my own ideas of what I think the grief's about, but what do you think it's stemming from?
Well, the obvious answer is the pandemic and just the complete upheaval of our lives, and whether people have lost someone during this time, which is a whole nother terrible layer to that, of not being able to gather and appropriately or fully grieve somebody.
I can't imagine like the funerals that had to be. I don't know if I can't even remember. Did they postpone a lot of them, or did they social distance with the funerals, or did they just not hold them? I literally can't remember.
I think they just weren't having funerals at all. And now quite a lot of them are being live broadcast. So if someone's not feeling comfortable going, or maybe if there's a capacity limit in the church or wherever they're having the ceremony, that other people who want to participate in it can do that. But whether someone's
that just adds to the pain. Sorry, it just adds to the pain and loss. I mean, not being able to have a normal gathering of a loved one when they die.
Well, and I was reading something the other day, just by somebody who had lost someone in this, during the pandemic, wasn't able to have a funeral service, and she was saying it's almost like your person has gone missing or something. You don't have that closure of, I don't know, sending them off, or, gathering together and kind of accepting the fact that this is happening. It's like someone tells you that it happened, but you're maybe just still wondering, not having that closure. Is that person going to walk through the door again? Maybe because we didn't have a funeral for them. So maybe this isn't, the whole thing's not real. But I think we're all kind of in a collective state of grief, because regardless of whether we lost an actual person, our lifestyles have been completely uprooted. We're not able to move freely about the country to different extents. Everything was completely frozen for a while and then opening up, and now we're seeing it pulled back again. And I really think that the grieving process is, sort of this deep well that we go into. And I'm not going to say that I'm grateful in any way for the grief that I've experienced, but I do know that well going into it has been a very rich place for me in terms of self-discovery. And so I think the gift in it may be that we're all having to do some soul searching right now, because we're all in this state of being shaken up, of being thrown down into the well.
Not to mention how it's compounded when you do lose somebody you love. I mean, you're already yourself trying to deal with this planetary, cycle of shadow or grief, and now an unknown. And then to lose, thankfully, I haven't lost anyone during this time, but I know people who have. And I'm sure that compounds, the shadow that we're already in. Everybody's life has been upended in some way. And then to add a death to that. The word that just stood out to me that you said was uncertainty. And that really hits for me, because I think a big part of grieving a person is sort of the uncertainty of what life is going to be like without that person in your life. And we are most certainly just living in a world of uncertainty right now. From one day to the next. It's such a lesson in surrender and accepting and in allowing what is. That couple episodes ago, I talked about that, just coming straight. And you brought it up when we started talking today before we hit record, about the quote I offered about your silent companion who holds up this lantern for you, which is your soul, and lights and illuminates the path ahead to your wholeness. And darkness and uncertainty kind of go together, don't you think? Just not being able to see or discern or use your senses to sort of know what's ahead. And in my mind, because I have lost loved ones very close to me, I feel like there's nothing that takes you down more than grief. Takes you right down into the shadow, right down into the dark, into an abyss, really. Can you share with us anything that you feel comfortable with of when you entered that abyss, what that was like for you when you lost your dad and when it kind of hit? Because sometimes you can lose somebody, but it doesn't actually really hit you. Sometimes for people, it's years later. Sometimes it's a week or a day later. Everyone has a different shock system, a shock absorber system in their system about how it lands for them.
Yeah.
And then some people can die and never really let themselves go into the abyss of losing that loved one. They just they can't. Mm-hmm. So we're all different, but how did that land for you?
Oh, well, for me, it hit very powerfully and immediately. And my family is very close. Not only my two siblings and my mom and my dad, but also my cousins and aunts and uncles. Everyone's very close and everyone just adored my dad. And it was, he had a heart attack and never woke up from that, but he was alive for 9 days in a coma. So we were in sort of this hellish purgatory for that period of time, not knowing whether he was going to wake up or not knowing what kind of state he would be if he did wake up. And so I guess in a sense, we sort of had that time to prepare. And when I eulogized him, I actually said I felt like that was his last gracious act of giving us that time to accept his death, that he was going to go, and to be able to, say goodbye to him. And, but I think what happened for me, or I know what happened for me, was actually about 2.5 or 3 months later. I had this idea in my head that grief had a timeline. I think a lot of people have that idea in their head. So it was sort of, all of these people were bringing meals and doing all these things for me during that sort of grieving period. And then that period of time ends and you sort of feel like you're supposed to be just getting on with everything and everything's going to go back to normal, but you don't even really know what normal is. And I have had such a beautiful life. I have such a beautiful life. Beautiful children, as I said, a close family. I have a job that I love, and all of these, beautiful home to live in, and all of these things. And I just got myself into a space where I couldn't stand my own company, because I just felt like you are the most ungrateful person in the world, because you have all of this and you are feeling so low and so in the well. And I just couldn't get myself out. And so that's sort of how I ended up, or that is how I ended up writing. It was an attempt to get myself out of the well. And my solution to it was to tell everybody on social media that I was going to write a gratitude post every day for a year is how it all started.
I've always wanted to do that. I see so many people doing it, and I'm like, I really should do that. But
yeah, I've always enjoyed it when people do it. And I thought, if I just wrote about how grateful I was every day, then it was sort of like fake it until you make it or something. Like, I just have to keep writing and reminding myself of how good I have it. And then I won't have to feel this terrible anymore. I'll just write myself out of the grief. And I did that for about a week. And then I realized how hollow it all felt, because I wasn't being sincere about how I was feeling. And so one day I just took a deep breath and wrote how I felt.
I want to ask you really quick with that. So how was your body experiencing what because intellectually and maybe even spiritually, you're like, I should be grateful. I have so many, and maybe this will dig me out, which is kind of like no judgment here. We all do it, but it's kind of like bypassing what you actually felt, perhaps embodied. So what were you actually feeling? What, if you just could go back in time and say, this is actually what I was really, really feeling, what was it?
I was just in a complete place of self-loathing, really. Just why am I still so sad when I have, all of these people who are so wonderful and all of these things that are so wonderful. And they are, and I did love them, but you're exactly right. I was trying to bypass, and I didn't have that thought or language at the time. It wasn't actually until I sat down to write the introduction to my book, which ended up coming to life from the writing that I began in those beginning months after my father passed, that I put that together and actually, wrote in the introduction. I was trying to just skip past the grieving part and go back to the grateful part. I didn't want to sit in the grief anymore. It was like I couldn't even stand it. And I thought that I could just put it aside and just be grateful. And then I realized I couldn't do that. And so I started to actually write about my grief and write about how I was really feeling.
Which I'm sure garnered a more sincere response from your followers than you trying to just stay in gratitude. Just saying. I mean,
yeah,
that vulnerability and the realness around that is really what people actually want to find on social media.
Yes.
They want to see someone who's in the depths. They want to see the real.
Yeah. And I think just being able to articulate my grief and how it was impacting me and how it was feeling, and sort of my love of metaphors. And I would often write about grief and give it a capital letter, as it was a person or a real entity, someone who is coming to visit me, and sort of making peace with that animal or that personification of grief. And I heard from so many people who were grateful for having the language and the words around their grief and how they were feeling, and that they had never been able to really articulate it. And reading the words was so validating.
Yeah. I just want to read part of your introduction because I can so relate to this part. You were talking about when you were in the deepest, darkest place. There I was in the dark, and something inside of me said quietly, the only way out is to write. Now I'm in an Airbnb this entire month of January, literally 5 minutes from my house, but it is to write, to get this draft done of my manuscript. And, I was told the same thing, coming out of a 7-year dark night of the soul, literally, to where it's finally hit its crescendo and I'm coming out of the descent journey. I'm sure we have a series of these throughout our lives, but I'm just saying right now, I can literally see when it started and what I've been in for the last 7 years. And so I was told the same thing, that this really isn't about me. Sure, there's some soul evolution stuff attached to it and a lot of growth, a lot of compassion that I'm developing, but somehow I've got to get it out of the ethereal onto a tangible page for not only myself, but again, it really isn't about me. It's for the humanity and the collective that I'm writing. It's to shift us out of this, or me personally speaking, to shift into a shadow, making shadow okay. Not just okay, but a necessary piece for stepping into your path and really being free. I was not taught, I don't know about you, but I was not taught that.
Oh God,
growing up. It's like you stay out of the dark, you stay out of the shadow. If you're feeling uncomfortable, if you're not feeling spiritual and peaceful, then there's something obviously unspiritual you're doing.
Well, I think that's why I really thought there was something wrong with me, because I was so used to being upbeat and, some friends of mine gave me the nickname Sunshine when I was in middle school and still call me that. And it was sort of like, if I'm not sunshiny. Who am I? And
Yes.
this isn't me. All of this darkness is not me, is kind of how I kept feeling about it. And it was like a snake skin that I needed to slub off of myself, and just, it felt constricted.
Just like, ew, like this is so unfamiliar. Yeah. Yeah.
It just felt so awful. And my whole writing process, I think for me, was about realizing the darkness is me. It's all me. Mm-hmm. And it all gets to belong. And nobody wants to feel the dark things, but it's all a part of us. And if we don't allow every piece of us to exist, then we're never going to feel right within ourselves.
Yes. And so when we're talking about, and my favorite chapter in your whole book is when you talk about this whole coexisting of grief and gratitude. And it's the chapter called The Nothing. Letting it sink in, you said that like gratitude and depression are not mutually exclusive. This seems like an incredibly important point to emphasize. Can we let that sink in? Gratitude and depression are not mutually exclusive. Do you want to elaborate on that? Because I mean, when we're talking about darkness, mm-hmm. sometimes that can be depression because we're going down, mm-hmm. we're descending. It's a pressing down of us into a shadow.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what the circumstances were that put us there. But what do you mean by that? How can we let that sink in? Gratitude and depression, not, it's kind of what we're already talking about, but maybe go into a little bit more of what you've learned.
I think just for me, it was the fact that all of the love that I had and all of the light that I had and all of the gratitude that I had didn't cease to exist just mm-hmm. because I was in a dark place. It didn't leave me.
Why do you think it didn't? What would be the purpose of it? I mean, from a grander perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think as human beings, we're just an integration of light and darkness. Mm-hmm. But I think because I hadn't experienced much darkness in my life, I just didn't even recognize that part of myself. Mm-hmm. So it was scary.
I like this part you said, and there is no hope without imagination.
Yeah.
So this seems like a good place to start, to be brave enough to imagine the future, I'm going to say that again because I highlighted it, to be brave enough to imagine the future. It isn't just about appreciating what I have. It's also about believing that there's beauty and happiness to come. I think that mm-hmm. hope piece mm-hmm. is part of that lantern that gets held up to illuminate. Sometimes mm-hmm. literally all you have is hoping to hope and hope mm-hmm. 3 layers deep that it'll get brighter. If you don't have that, what do you have? And I think you hit it on the head that we can't have that hope without imagining it.
Yes.
Somehow seeing it or using our faculties and our imagination to see something on the other side.
Yeah. I was in a state of depression at some point last year, probably maybe several points last year.
Yeah, me too. Hello.
But this one particular day, I found myself just dropping my children off at school and then coming home and just like getting into bed in the fetal position. It's just like all I could do for that day. And later on that day, I was reading this article about ADD, and I hope I can articulate this well because this just came to mind, but it was something that I wrote about online. But that people who have ADD, that actually just in general, people, if they're going to be doing something, they imagine what it is they're going to be doing without even realizing it. They imagine a picture of it in their head. So if they're going to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, they imagine the bread, they imagine spreading the peanut butter and the jelly, and that's what helps them to gather the ingredients and put it together. And people who struggle with ADD, can have a difficult time imagining the sandwich to then be able to take the steps to gather the things that are needed to make the sandwich. It's like to the way that our brains process. And I was likening that to being kind of in this depressed state of, I was like, that's what's going on with me right now. It feels like I can't imagine the sandwich. Like I can't think about what I need to do next because it all feels so dark and hard to think about what the next thing is going to be. And so it's sort of a crippling experience. But when we were talking about that, the poem that you had read on your blog podcast about the silent companion lighting the lanterns, I was thinking about, and just we were discussing the idea of having to trust the fact that path exists, even though you can't see it until the next lantern is lit. I was thinking about the story in my book about the fog. And I had written about how, driving across the bridge in the fog and you're on top of the bridge and
such a great
bridge
metaphor.
Disappears and you just can't see where you're going, but you don't stop your car and get out. You move more slowly. You might be a little bit more cautious, a little more nervous, but your brain knows that the bridge is there. And so it's just sort of like that trusting in the darkness that things will illuminate as you go along. And so to me, kind of finding my way through the darkness, through the fog, there had to be that element of trust or imagining and trust about what I was going to find on the other side of it.
I like how you talk about that there's this fear of falling into some dark well or some pit or something where you're not going to be able to get out of it. Yeah. That somehow once you fall, and maybe that's the resistance we have of just holding and staying attached really to the fear, is that if I let go, I'm going down. And I can tell you that I've lost loved ones to depression. My sister committed suicide. My aunt committed suicide. My aunt was 32 and had a 3-year-old son. My sister was 34 and had 5 children, ages 2 to 12. And what we noticed, because they were both kind of artistic and they kept journals. My aunt wrote poetry. My sister wrote in her journals and was a singer and everything and wrote music. But what we noticed is that tipping point for them to choose out was they lost hope. They literally couldn't see. And my sister said as much in her suicide letter. My aunt also left a suicide letter. But it was like, I just don't see any other way. There was no imagining of a brighter future. It was like, I'm in this bottom and it's so dark. There isn't an awareness that there's something trying to light my path. There's a blocking of that. And I would certainly never judge somebody who can't gather their faculties enough to imagine. And that's where you reach out. That's literally where you say, I cannot see. What a leader does, or a guide, is they act as proxy for that person's soul and literally light the path for them. Here's what I see for you. We tried to do this with my sister so many times. The block is what you had referred to earlier, was absolute horrific self-loathing. Yeah. That was blocking the imagination. Yeah. That was blocking her ability to envision a future, because she was so, to use your metaphor, dipped in self-loathing. Yeah, it's heavy. And so, for anyone who's listening, who has a loved one in that place, or they themselves or maybe we cycle into it. Some of us can get out quicker than others. I think we've all been in that place in some way, shape, or form. I've never met anyone, and they're lying if they say maybe not lying, but maybe they don't have the awareness that we've all been confronted with our own mortality to the point where, do I want to stay or do I want to go? Like, I can't handle it anymore. And bar none, it's those who reach out. I can't imagine if I hadn't, I was going to ask you this question too, if I hadn't reached out along my dark night of soul journey the last 7 years, if I hadn't found this teacher or this teacher found me, because usually the universe sends them to you. You don't really have to search them out. You just have to look at what's in front of you. That is the path that's being illuminated. What's in front of me right now? Who do I know? What did somebody say in passing? What book found its way to me? What's being illuminated right now? But I can't imagine how differently things would have gone had I not reached out. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons I started this podcast in 2019. I just turned 50, coming up on my 3-year anniversary in February, because I needed what these women like yourselves could help. I needed their light. I needed more perspective. I needed women who'd been through the dark night and were either transitioning out of it or were still in the descent journey and could give me some perspective. So this is where I feel like if we are going to move into hope, if we are going to let depression and darkness and gratitude to sort of coexist, and we just can't muster the faculties, if we don't reach out and if we don't look to someone else to light that path for us, we're going to stay in that dark place. There's just no other way to, I don't know how else to put it. Did you find that you were in a place where you had to do that, where you had to reach for help? It's not an easy thing. It's actually quite humbling to have to ask for that help.
Yeah. And I think it's important just to acknowledge that many people are just not able to reach out, which is why I think, with the depression rate having skyrocketed so much through the pandemic, there have been so many sort of public service messages about checking on people and reaching out if you're not hearing from someone, because sometimes it just gets past. And obviously, this, having, experienced close family members being taken by suicide, that it just crosses a point of no return for some people where they're just not able to do that. But the chapter that you mentioned about the nothing, just to give that some context for those who were ever fans of the Never-Ending Story, the chapter talks about a conversation that I had with my friend Monica Rogers, who you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, who has been an absolute wonderful resource to me in my life. But I reached out to her and just was expressing to her that I was just in this terrible place and I just didn't know what to do. And she kind of actually coached me through that. Well, what does that feel like? And my response was, it feels like the nothing. Like, that was the image that came to me. And she said, and what is the nothing? And I thought about it. And so in this book, which is also a movie too, the nothing was not a thing. It was an absence of everything. It wasn't like this big black blob that was coming to take over the world. It was actually this void that was sucking everything into it. So, it was that feeling like everything good was being taken away or was gone, and that I was just feeling nothing, which is the scariest place. I think it's so much scarier than sad. The place of nothing. Because as you said, you do need to be able to visualize good things and have hope and have that light and have those lanterns and have that trust that on the other side of the fog, all of the metaphors that all exists. And so I think what I wrote in my story was that I felt like my task in that moment was to try and stave off the nothing with my own light.
Wow. and having to resource where that is inside of you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you'll know you enter the dark night. This is what someone told me: when something happens to you that you didn't create or cause, it just shows up as a teacher. It could be the loss of a loved one. I have to say, I cycled through my sister's loss 17 years ago. And here I am 17 years later. It still hurts. But what's interesting, Bethany, is that the dark night that I went through 7 years ago sort of was incited with trying to get this little baby girl and adopt her through the foster system and all kinds of drama with that. But when it hit its sort of crescendo was when I started to deconstruct my faith, when I started to deconstruct the beliefs that I was handed at birth and all of the roles and responsibilities and expectations, the truth claims. I'm really looking at the absence of a mother in the patriarchal system. And that sent me deeper and darker into the best analogy I have. I really like your analogy of the dark well, but here's mine. It was like I was an astronaut in space attached to a mothership, like an umbilical cord, you know, that cord that astronauts use. I was attached to the mothership. The mothership was beautiful and people I loved and safety and community and familiarity. Okay. And I was attached to that. And when I started to deconstruct my beliefs and my past conditioning, it's like I untethered myself from the mothership and I went careening into outer space, into the void that you're referencing. And to be honest with you, this still gives me chills. That was actually about 100 times harder than losing my sister to suicide and the 4 miscarriages I had and all of the other loss, finding my grandfather dead, my aunt's suicide. That untethering of the mothership was so incredibly disorienting and dark that it eclipsed my other losses and compounded my other losses. So sometimes this grief is more than form, like a person or a thing. Sometimes it's ideologies. Sometimes it's role expectations. Have you ever experienced anything like that? Maybe it's because I'm getting older and I'm like, ooh, I feel like what we're being confronted with right now is this planetary reckoning, but it's going to happen to each one of us individually. What do you believe? For me, it's the duality that I was confronted with. How am I holding duality? Good, bad, right, wrong. That just got shattered. And I went into this like trying now to see everything as oneness and integrating back into a more inclusive, feminine, nuanced view of life and humanity. And I'm wondering if you've experienced anything like that. I mean, some of our upbringings are a little more high demand and orthodox than others, but it sounds like you had a wonderful childhood and maybe even idyllic, being called the sunshine girl. Have you ever had to confront any of your beliefs to the point where it sent you spiraling down?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think how I've discussed the fact, I mean, my mother, loved my mother very much. And she would be, you know, the first to accept this description. She's not a very emotive person. I've probably, you know, up until the point my father died, I think I'd seen her cry once in my life. And even with my father's passing, she very much felt like she needed to keep her emotions in check and not lose it in front of any of us. She very much, you know, would loosen up to the point where she'd tell me that she had lost it at home or that she'd had a hard day where she'd been crying a lot, but never in front of me. And her mother was much the same way. And you know, her grandmother. So I'm sort of an anomaly in terms of the female line in that family. And she'll always say, like, she doesn't know where I came from, that I am very demonstratively affectionate and all of these things, which I think comes more from my father's side of the family. We get made fun of because we're all big criers. For happy cry, sad cry, laughing too hard, we're crying, all of the crying. And so I think my moment of feeling untethered was just having to process all, as I said, like all of the dark things, because it didn't feel like it was me or a part of me. And so not really, I guess the ideology there is just, pushing back more extremely on the idea that we're not supposed to talk about how we're feeling, and just,
maybe you're just the pattern breaker in your family. Maybe you're the one that's, And when that had to awaken in you, like, hey, is this healthy? What have I been carrying around that? Yeah.
But I think, it's funny. People have asked me in interviews about whether I, felt uncomfortable or embarrassed about being so vulnerable and sharing so openly about my feelings. And it's kind of funny, not funny to me, which is sort of like, I was in such a deep well, as I said, that I felt like I had no further down to go. Like, there was no embarrassment or, it was just like, I felt like it can't get worse.
Yeah.
I can't feel worse than I feel right now.
I've been to the worst part.
So no, like, embarrassment was not really on my mind. I just needed to expel it, needed to express it, needed to get it out. And then, moving on, there definitely were times when I would write about something that would feel very scary. And typically that was more about my journey in romantic relationships, because I think I held more shame around, my behavior in some situations. And so that felt scary and vulnerable to me. But I also discovered that the more scary and the more vulnerable something that I wrote felt to me, the more people related to it. And the more responses I would get from people who would just say, "Oh my God, me too. That sounds like you took a page out of my diary," or I went through this exact experience. And so it was interesting to me through my writing, whether it was about grief or just about sort of reclaiming myself, or, as you would say, becoming whole, that the more, the deeper I went, the more people could relate to it. And I think that's so interesting, because it just tells me that these experiences we're all keeping to ourselves and thinking that it's just us, or that there's something embarrassing or shameful about it. And the reality is that these are universal experiences and feelings. Maybe not the exact experience, but
absolutely
what it brings up for a person.
It's the common human experience. And the more that we normalize these things through vulnerability and openness and sharing, the less it gets stigmatized, and we all just be real with each other. Well, I've loved where we've gone with this conversation. I would just say thank you for showing up today on the anniversary, the death anniversary, as you say, of your father's passing. What was his name, by the way?
Bill Harvey.
I honor you for taking your grief and putting in the outlet of this wonderful book, Dipped in It, which I recommend everyone go out and get. It's wonderful. It's beautiful and affirming, very inspiring. And I'm just grateful that we've made this association with each other, and that I can pass along your writings to other people who might benefit. Where can they find your book?
So the book is available pretty much through any bookstore. Any bookstore can order it. It's really the bookstores that are more familiar with it, more in my area, that have it in stock, which is in Rhode Island. But it's also available online, barnesandnoble.com, Amazon.com, Target. Yeah, Amazon, Target, Books A Million. There are a bunch of online big bookstores where you can get it. But any bookstore, if you walked into it, if you really like to shop at your independent bookstore, you could go in and just ask for it and they can order it for you. It might take a few days, but if you're willing to wait for it, you can get it that way.
That's great that you have so many avenues for people to be able to access it. I love it. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your presence today. Thank you so much for having me here. It was really nice to meet you. And I'm so glad that we made this connection through Monica. And it's funny, I think about all of the wonderful connections that she has made through her work and her podcast with the Revelation Project. It's there are just so many, tentacles out into the world. Oh yeah. Yes, I was just listening to her episode with Bergen Hyde, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to meet Bergen now. And now you. And so thank you for your time. Thank you so much. Darkness is the depth, and in the darkness is where we have our sacred longings that we can express. And Bethany in her book talked about there's no hope without imagination. So it's in that darkness that we see that glimmer of hope and we glom onto it and we come to know our own strength and we use our imagination to help that hope grow brighter. Of course, we attach to our spiritual anchors, constructs that allow us to have this imagery to be able to climb out. If you can't see further ahead, it's really hard to go further ahead. So again, you can find Bethany on Bethany Harvey Author on Instagram. Be watching for our launch of Stand, Speak, Shine course that's coming up. You can get on the wait list by going to CherieBurton.com or StandSpeakShine.com. So lots of options for you to help climb out of the darkness, to find your light, to find your power within. Have a glorious week, and I will talk to you next time on Women Seeking Wholeness.